Okay, so this is a brief video on what is engineering. Now, essentially, what we've done here is last time around we took technology, so that's the T in STEM, and this time we're going to take a look at what is engineering, the E in STEM. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking the principles of science and math and you're using them to solve a problem. Okay, so somebody has a problem, they hand it to you, you use mathematics and scientific principles to solve those problems. So there's a whole list of things that engineers actually end up doing. They do design, right? They evaluate, like, is this a good method? Is it not? They have to do development. So this is the idea of making something better over time. They have to test to see if it is better and then continuing to modify, right? Sometimes you're doing installations, right? So you're putting things in place, you are inspecting things, and sometimes you are maintaining things, right? So things sometimes are systems that need additional energy or additional maintenance to keep themselves going. There's also part of this where like there's a soft side to engineering where you're making recommendations. I have a friend that's a software engineer who makes recommendations on how to use his product to the people who are using it. They sometimes specify materials saying, look, if you're going to build that, the best thing to build it out is this, or specify also a process. Like the best way of doing that would be to do the following things. Some engineers are supervisors. They also are people so they're supervising either manufacturing or construction. They do field work, so they go out in the field and they look at what's really there and then try to see how a certain technology is performing in the field. They do consulting work. So like somebody says, I have this problem. What can you tell me about possible ways to do this? And also some engineers teach. There's college professors, high school teachers, or engineers who are doing teaching to try to teach methods to other people. So one of the big keys at this point is like trying to understand all the different types of engineers there are. So we're just going to kind of make a list here and I'll describe each one as I named them. There are mechanical engineers, which is probably the most basic form of an engineer. These are people who are designing or manufacturing or inspecting like machinery, equipment, and their components. Okay, so these are people who like build vehicles or design vehicles. They're people who design construction and farm machinery. There are people who develop industrial tools. So a mechanical engineer might be like, okay, so we have this problem, we need a tool to solve this problem. So they'll build the tool that actually solves the problem. Another big branch of engineering are electrical engineers. Most people that describe themselves as engineers are electrical engineers. Sometimes they're called EEs. Okay. Electrical engineers are people who do designing, testing, manufacturing, constructing, controlling things that involve electrical or electronic devices. These people develop circuit boards for computers. They figure out how to generate power, like with big, huge power plants. They figure out how to distribute power using transformers and things like that. You have civil engineers, who are the people who are designing and maintaining large infrastructure projects. So these are people who are trying to figure out highways and railroads, bridges, tunnels, dams. Like how do you get people from place to place within a populated area. It's like the development of cities as civil engineers. Um, Particularly around here, we have some aerospace engineers. So these are people who develop, um, manufacture, construct things that are involving aircrafts or um, spacecraft. So they do things like the airframes. They look at how do you supply power when something's in motion in the air or in space. How do you do control and guidance? How do you make sure that the space shuttle gets to where it needs to get to? How do you maintain the electrical systems on board? How do you get communication? Like, how do you get satellite communication from a satellite to Earth and back again? How do you do navigation? Like, if you're in an airplane, how do you decide what direction that you're heading and what instruments do you have for that? There's nuclear engineering. So this is about nuclear radiation. These are folks that basically are looking at how do I design systems that harness nuclear radiation for either like nuclear reactors to generate power. Sometimes you have some nuclear engineers that are working with things like radioisotopes. So that could be like developing contrast for MRI machines, things like that. So yeah, anything that's involving nuclear radiation, that's your nuclear engineers. We have structural engineers. Structural engineers are working with a little bit of the big picture, anything that's load bearing. So things like commercial buildings, the building that you're sitting in probably had a structural engineer looking at that. Large bridges, industry, like how do I make a huge conveyor belt or a huge clean room work? So this is something that a structural engineer might get involved with. We have biomedical. Okay, so biomedical engineers work with anything that's in the medical field. They design systems and equipment that work in that field. So it could be like surgical devices, things like laparoscopic surgical tools, or prosthetics like artificial limbs, things like that. Durable medical equipment, like some people have like CPAP machines or might have something that helps them breathe, things like that. So this is the type of thing a biomedical engineer would get involved in. We have chemical engineers. So chemical engineering is taking raw materials and exploiting them because of their chemical processes, using like mixing compounds to make valuable products. Things like polymers, which are kind of types of plastics, are an example of a chemical engineer's work. Things like pharmaceuticals, the medicine that people take that's like in the chemical form would be something a chemical engineer would work. Steel is a chemical process, so that's chemical engineering. You have computer engineers. So you have both hardware and software engineers, people who develop the components of a computer system as well as the programs that run on them are called engineers. So these are people who develop computer networks. The people that designed your cell phone would be a computer engineer. App developers are computer engineers. Industrial engineers. This is like kind of a group that crosses over a lot of other groups. Industrial engineers are folks that are like designing and optimizing facilities, equipment, and systems for manufacturing. So like any place that you're doing large scale manufacturing are like building cars. How do you design the plant that's going to build the cars? Not the design of the car, but the design of the plant. Or like sometimes industrial engineers get into like how do we use like big huge 3D printers to like try to create real life things that are useful. Or one of the things is like designing facilities to do construction in a controlled environment. So like a lot of the trusses that went on the new dorm were just rolled in here, completely assembled. They were built in a factory that was designed by an industrial engineer. Environmental. I'm spelling that wrong. environmental. There we go. Environmental engineers are people who are trying to prevent or reduce or eliminate sources of pollution. So these are people who are developing ways that are doing like water cleanup, like the big trash wheel that's down in the Baltimore Inner Harbor. Industrial scrubbers on factories to make sure that we're not adding pollutants to the air. Reclamation of wetlands is something that could be engineered. Controlling invasive species is a huge project that engineers get involved in. So this is all types of environmental engineering. Engineering, finally, and again, is the application of math and science to solve problems. And like we said here, there are numerous types of engineers. Awesome.